Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Constance Sayers. I'm the president of Government Executive Media Group, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Data Security Workshop, Overcoming Challenges Amid the Dissolving Perimeter, hosted by TALUS. Just one real quick, as you all are coming into the room, just one real quick thing is that if you wouldn't mind, everyone is coming up as Kayla McLeod, who is our wonderful program manager for today's event. If you wouldn't mind, just change your name to your name in Zoom by clicking on the three dots to the top right of your screen. You'll see three dots, and then choose rename, and then just whatever screen name that you want, just so we can, can definitely have you with your correct name. So just a little bit of quick housekeeping there. So a little bit about today's event. As government agencies pursue digital transformation from cloud adoption to the embrace of the Internet of Things, data security has become increasingly complex, moving beyond the network perimeter to the cloud. With emerging technologies such as quantum computing on the horizon, this complexity will only increase. In an era when the security perimeter is dissolving, how can government agencies ensure their critical data is secure no matter where it's located and who is accessing it and on what platform? So today I'm excited to welcome you to our interactive virtual workshop where you're going to hear from experts who are going to discuss these questions, and then you're going to participate in your own breakout conversation with your peers. So in a moment, we'll be hearing from a panel of government and industry experts about securing critical data. When the panel concludes, the conversation will turn inward to virtual breakout rooms. It's just like in the live world, you would just move from the general session room into a breakout session where we're going to mimic that virtually. So we've heard that you miss networking with each other, so we're going to help you out there. So each of you will be sorted into a breakout room where you're going to share your perspectives on how your agency is strengthening its security posture, and hear best practices and expert discussion leaders and peers. So each breakout room has a general discussion theme and a designated discussion facilitator. And just a reminder on that, we definitely want to make sure that your name is your correct name. So once again, if you wouldn't mind, just on the three dots at the top of the right of your screen, choose rename as an option, and then the screen name that you want. I mean, for when you go into the breakout session, so that you can get the most out of your networking. So after our breakout discussions, we will reconvene here for a roundup of the top themes that people learned. So it's just like, again, moving between rooms in a live event, but you don't even have to leave your sofa today, which is great. So a few things to note before we get started. To enjoy the best experience of the panel discussion, please ensure your screen is set to speaker view in the top right corner. If you have any technical difficulties throughout today's workshop, just contact GEMG Help in the chat box. We have a group of folks standing by to help you as we navigate. The entirety of today's event will be recorded, and the panel will be available for on-demand viewing, which is great. So now to kick things off for our panel discussion, I am pleased to introduce Kirk Spring, who is president of TALUS Trusted Cyber Technology, Jeff Harris, who is Chief of Cybersecurity Operations for the Small Business Administration, and Shane Barney, Chief Information Security Officer at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Welcome, everybody. So before we dive in, I just want, can you all just briefly describe your roles and responsibilities at your organization? And I will start with Kirk.
Thanks, Connie. Yes, I'm Kirk Spring, president of TALUS Trusted Cyber Technologies. We're a federally focused piece of TALUS, providing data security and authentication products. My role in the company is obviously to set our strategic position and our strategic roadmaps for solving its most complicated security issues. We've been around for probably in this type of business for over 20 years now as part of SafeNet, which became Gemalto and then TALUS. So extensive background within the government. All of our employees are government focused, but we leverage a lot of commercial technologies.
Great. And then Jeff Harris, tell us a little bit about what you do at Small Business Administration.
All right. Nope. Pleasure. Thank you. So yeah, again, I'm Jeff Harris, Chief of Cybersecurity Operations at SBA. If you're not familiar with SBA as an organization, kind of really like to look at it as probably one of the biggest federal banks of sorts, where our main mission is not only to provide loan assistance and loan guarantees through actual financial resources and education, but it's just further how we enable, the small business community, which is really what we kind of see as the, cornerstone of democracy here. So my role is specifically focused on ensuring that we have all the appropriate technical security kind of capabilities in place. And those are from a people, process, and perspective. So these are things like, leveraging critical cyber intelligence to better inform the decisions and the capabilities that we put in place. Is leveraging proactive things like threat hunting and penetration testing to determine what potential gaps may exist and how we can learn from things from an adversarial perspective. It's just the list really goes on and on. But yeah, overall ultimate goal is just, how do we kind of put the right things in place to protect the agency and the citizen data that we're entrusted with.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. And Shane, tell us a little bit about your role and responsibilities.
Hi everyone, and welcome. As CISSP for the agency for USCIS, my primary responsibility is obviously to oversee the cybersecurity program for all aspects of the organization. This includes risk management, governance, and FISMA compliance, as well as security operations like SOC and threat intel, as well as our penetration testing program. And as an agency, we are 26,000 plus employees spread throughout the world. 250 something locations, I believe. So it's a big operation. We are primarily a cloud-based organization. I think we were one of the very first federal agencies to jump into the cloud, and we've been there for 10 years now, maybe a little longer. And so at this point, we're 85, 90% cloud-based. So we have a lot of experience for doing this, both good, bad, and ugly. And so, happy to share lessons learned along the way. So happy to be here.
Great. And we will definitely have some great lessons learned. And also, as we're just about to get to, I think a lot of our government speakers have had their jobs greatly affected and their missions. So that's something we're going to get into in a moment here. So cyber threats are constantly evolving with new actors, vulnerabilities, security risks. What are the biggest areas of cybersecurity that you're focused on right now? And Shane, I'll go to you with that.
Cybersecurity is such a huge topic. So it's focusing on a few things is hard, but we are, as an agency and an organization, we are focused heavily on a couple things. We are a heavy DevSecOps agile development program. Everything we run, I don't even know how many developers we have, a couple thousand, I swear. So a lot of development, a lot of moving parts are always going on. I mean, there's daily releases. So a very active program. So in order for the security program to maintain that, we have to compete. We have to basically be an agile security program. So what does that mean, and what do we want to focus on? So for me, I want to be both proactive looking forward, but I also want to make sure that I'm covering my bases going forward. So we're focusing on things like intelligence and hunting, threat hunting, as well as our response capabilities. So we're working heavily to develop new advanced analytics programs because of the volume of data flowing in from all these different actions and different activities that are going on in the organization. It's too much for one individual to take on. So automating as much of our security operations side is critical for us in moving forward, and has been, and we've been very successful at it. We're also heavily focused on a lot more standardization across our organization. Defining what is normal is critical and unbelievably hard, very hard to do. So for me, looking at all this information flowing around, we want to make sure that we can weed out and get rid of what we don't know is good versus the bad. And that's proving to be more challenging than I had thought it would be, but we are making steady progress towards that end. And this is all going to tie back into more of a zero trust sort of approach to how, as an organization, we approach identity, and basically authentication and authorization across the board. Starting not just with our users, but I'm talking every asset, every aspect of our organization, getting to the point where we can authenticate basically all pieces, parts, and anything that moves, breathes, touches, we interact with. We want to have the ability to authorize it and to make sure that we know what it is and who it is. So that's kind of where we're at.
That's great. Wonderful.
A lot.
Yeah, no, it is a lot, as I'm sure. And Jeff, why don't you we'll stick with our government panelists here, and just Jeff, tell us a little bit about what your biggest areas of cybersecurity that you're focusing on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, to some of the points that Shane touched on there, definitely. Really there's an opportune time for, malicious actors to really be taking advantage of some of the things that we're experiencing in the world. Obviously, the COVID-19 is one of those biggest things. So it's really, allowed us to see a significant uptick in certain types of malicious activity. Email is always one of the biggest threat vectors, but it's obviously got a lot more advanced associated around some of the things we're doing from a response perspective and things we need to have visibility on. So we are really looking at investing too and taking advantage of a lot of innovation, whether that's taking opportunities and leveraging SOAR capabilities. That's where we can say, hey, there's so much chatter, so many things we need to focus on. What are those things that we can really have our analysts look at from a high value work perspective, and we'll allow tools and automation to really take care of a lot more of the low value work. So that's an area that we're really focused on right now. Further associated with, kind of COVID response and just what the agency does, one of the things that this has allowed us to see recently is that, and this goes with most kind of cybersecurity programs and government organizations, your focus is generally always internal, right, to that customer base and the organization that you help enable their mission. But we're seeing that there's definitely a need for us to further extend out kind of what we do to the kind of private citizen and the customer perspective. And we've already done some of that work in the past and working with other organizations with regards to empowering the small business community with cybersecurity resources. But, again, this has allowed us to understand that we need to take even a further approach. So this is getting into areas to where we can leverage some of our same internal resources and focus on things like how can we get credible and actionable threat intelligence to the small business community, but in a way that they can actually digest and understand and take some type of appropriate action on. Even further in an area to where how can we help them in ensuring that, when they're looking at capabilities to protect them, right? We give you great information. Now there's something you need to do with it. How can we further enable their ability to properly select the right vendors and the right technologies, right, to really get the defenses and capabilities they need placed.
Yeah.
So that's a lot where we're and innovate really key to a lot of those things. Agency that really kind of likes to lean forward on a lot of things. So we are really investing in doing a lot more in the AI and space also
Right.
to really kind
And
of help.
Kirk, talk a little bit about, as a private sector partner to government, what have been some of your, biggest focus areas right now?
Well, I guess I'll jump right on the Shane and Jeff train here. So obviously from industry, we look at where the government agencies are headed. We're a data security company, so obviously we look at data security in general, and then we spawn off that. So one of the biggest areas right now is in data discovery. We find that a lot of the agencies we talk to aren't really aware of how much data they have and where it resides. So one of the areas we're looking at is, well, how do we help the government agencies find the data, find the critical data, and then tag it? So the theme around this is really protecting the data as it lives, where it lives and where it transitions. Especially with the dissolving perimeter, the data is going to move around quite a bit, and it's going to move outside the conventional physical barriers now that we're used to over the last 20 years. And then automation was brought up, process automation. We're really delving in heavily into what we call robotic process automation. This is where there's bots running on the networks to automate these processes so the human entities don't have to do it. But to do that, you have to trust the bots that are running on your network. It all comes back to trust, and Shane mentioned it, and authorizations. So who has the authorization to touch what data when? And even to not just the human entities, but the physical entities, where are those entities residing? Where are they? There's a lot of talk around, geofencing. Who has access to the network at a certain time of the day, depending where they are physically, and what role they're logging into the network with. So we focus kind of on the whole gamut, but when you really get down to it, it comes back to protecting the data. Even when you talk about authentication, it's all around protecting the data, who has access to it, and where the data lives.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I mean, COVID-19 and the government's whole shift to telework, I want to talk a little bit about some of the environment in which we're, if cybersecurity were in a vacuum, would be one thing, but we now have, an enormous impact on cybersecurity with the workforce accessing critical systems remotely. So, how has this changed data security? What new challenges have really arisen? And what challenges have been accelerated? I mean, I think, things that might have taken a year, we didn't really have a year to do things. So, and I'm going to get to Kirk in a second. I'm actually going to start with Jeff. I mean, kind of like walk us back to like mid-March, how did life change for you a little bit? And, and as everyone migrated to work, remotely?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'll say probably the biggest change was a lot less sleep, but adjusting to that now there. But no, seriously, it's I don't think it's something that anyone really could have ever planned. And what I mean is how agencies would have to respond and adjust to, if nothing else, the increased demands for remote and telework. So within that, right, and obviously data is a big part of that, because ultimately at the end of the day, that's what we really kind of gain access to, is data through different technology capabilities. It really required us to look hard at saying, hey, the paradigm has shifted so much that it's not only that people are accessing these things remotely, but we're creating situations now to where we're utilizing different technologies than what we normally would. Example would be leveraging VDI more for the increased demands of whether it's our surge employees or additional new term employees coming on to help provide, loan assistance to consumers and small businesses. So within that, it was a rapidly, adopting more cloud, leveraging the capabilities within that, really having an awareness and visibility of, who are these people that generally go through some type of normal vetting process, which is a little different. There's a lot more just remote workers just in the context of bringing all these surge employees. So yeah, it really required us to make some dynamic shifts. One of those was that, on any given day, SBA as an organization is probably around 3,000, 4,000 individuals, but we also surge through our Office of Disaster Assistance for any type of disaster that happens, tornadoes, hurricanes, up to 5,000 employees.
Okay.
We're now in an area to where we surge to 20,000 employees. Which
I was going to say, because you ended up right in the thick of things for economic recovery efforts. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And within there, it was also a need for us to increase some of our capacity in regards to some of our systems that generally aren't used to handling, the bandwidth and the usage from the amount of loans and other activities we're receiving. So again, it created a heavier need for other types of technology. And doing those, it was like really focusing quickly on what are the types of things that we need to have in place to protect this data. And then further, again, I'll talk about the visibility of that data and kind of where it's going to, because there were just a lot of rapid things that we needed to do to, again, further enable the mission and the new directives that the agency was given.
Well, and, so while things were kind of, Shane you had a very different kind of story going on at, at USCIS. I mean, so you would talk a little bit about, I love hearing about your missions too, and kind of, how the technology kind of, impacted everything, because you were saying earlier in our session about how it just greatly impacted your mission.
Yep. USCIS, we are the agency responsible for granting lawful immigration benefits. So if you apply for a work permit to become a legal permanent resident of the United States, you would come to USCIS. If you want to naturalize a U.S. citizen, you would come to USCIS. And we do a number of other things, including refugee and asylum work as well. So, and a lot of that work is done, actually all of it is done on a fee-based schedule. So we don't receive appropriated funds at all. We are, in that respect, we're like a business. We actually earn money and we pay for ourselves and pay forward, and that's how we operate. Of course, when COVID hit and we could no longer go into our offices and could not function at a normally level, the ability for us to take in revenue was greatly reduced, like any business. And that impact hit us hard. On top of that, then of course now we have to restructure and try to figure out a way to operate in this new kind of, full-time telework thing. So we went from an agency that on an average day probably had about 5,000 teleworkers to an agency that had over 20,000 teleworkers on a daily basis. And so the challenges that were presented, and as a heavy data organization, and everything we deal with is in people data, lots of privacy information and floating around, flying around. Clearly this became of a concern. Now we hadn't been thinking this was going to happen, but we knew at some point as an agency, we were looking to the future thinking, hey, someday in the future, we don't want everything inside buildings. So we sort of started some plans along those lines in terms of how our systems operate and how they function. being in the cloud as much as we are was a significant benefit. And we've also invested heavily in virtualized desktoping. So our organization functioned fairly well in that respect. The challenges that we saw were some of the things that we have to do in office. So those are like the naturalization interviews or other interviews that require kind of a person-to-person, face-to-face sort of interaction. And that's where the technology really kicked in, and we accelerated some things that we thought about, maybe kicked around a little bit, but went from a project that normally we'd do over about a year space of time, we did in a month and a half, which was to deploy a video teleconferencing system throughout our organization that allows us to do those interviews without having to be in person. It just went live. Well, we started to do the pilot testing yesterday. So, we've been very successful at that. But there are still challenges, and there are data concerns. Given the amount of volume of information we handle, the amount of information we deal with on a day-to-day basis, having everybody full-time remote does present certain concerns. But this is where a lot of our sort of, security in depth comes into play, our encryption at the local level, the way we encrypt our traffic through the various tunnels. And we're also working on some other things that are going to help alleviate some of those concerns, sort of mitigate those risks and buy down that risk.
Yeah.
So overall, I think we're good. We're making progress.
That's great. And Kirk, let's talk a little bit. I'd love to have you talk a little bit about what you see, like what's going to be the impact of this down the line. Around data security, particularly as it relates to the dissolving perimeter. What's this going to look like in the future? And how is it going to impact the trends around data security in the future?
Yeah, good question. Zero trust has been mentioned, and it's kind of an up and coming thing, and it's going to accelerate, I think, the zero trust model, and that means a lot to a lot of people, but basically it all gets around the dissolving perimeter. We've already talked about that. It's going to accelerate that. You've heard from Jeff and Shane about the remote workforces. And, I think one area right now that's probably weak that I think will accelerate is collaboration tools. There's some collaboration tools out there, but a lot of them are for internal use, and collaboration tools around the data. And I hate to harp on the data, but that's what it's all about, protecting the data, at least for us. And I'm sure Shane and Jeff would agree, right? Shane just mentioned, PII data, which is ultimately important. So, collaboration through a full, transparent, dissolved perimeter workforce. I think that's where you're going to see an acceleration of technologies. Obviously, with the movement to the cloud and services being provided out there, that should help that, I think. But then building the proper security around that to protect that data and kind of trace the data where it moves. And this really comes back to some of the things stated about compliance, right? So there's standards out there that say, hey, you need to know where your data is at and who's accessing it. So the data is really going to get spread outside that normal perimeter. It's not just going to be in an S3 bucket. It's just not going to be on someone's laptop in the office. That data is going to roam everywhere now with this dissolved perimeter.
Yeah. Well, also with cloud, the Internet of Things, anything as a service, and DevOps taking an increasingly prominent place in the federal government's IT strategy, we've seen data, as you said, Kirk, live more and more outside the traditional network perimeter. So my question here is for Shane and Jeff, what does this dissolving perimeter look like at your agency, and how has it impacted basically your overall security posture? And Shane, I'll start with you on this.
It's interesting. When we moved to the cloud, we at first looked at cloud as nothing more than an extension of prem. It didn't take us long to figure out that was certainly not the case. And frankly, the second we stepped into the cloud is when we sort of ended the traditional network perimeter. It was gone. Now we can pretend that the perimeter still exists if we want. Reality is it doesn't. It's virtualized. It's there when you choose it to be there, but it can be easily dissolved just as quickly. So, in terms of what that means to us, and especially as USCIS kind of moves to a different type of system development, we're going to move towards a more serverless type of organization where, we're not going to rely on these, monolithic systems, even in cloud. We're going to be developing these things at very macro level or micro levels so that we can take advantage of all the different multi-cloud options that are out there to us. What does this do? Well, this actually changes the entire paradigm of what makes a system. We define systems under FISMA as very distinct sort of entities. Well, under a service environment, that's no longer the case. And data flows in ways that we don't traditionally understood it to flow. So it presents some really interesting challenges, especially for federal agencies. So we're gonna have to develop, we're in the process actually right now is developing an entire new approach to how to authorize something like that. Whereas no longer we're gonna authorize the system, what we're gonna do is authorize the development platform. And then anything that comes out of that development platform inherits that authorization. What that does for us in all kinds of, it solves a number of really interesting problems for us, kind of on the compliance side, but really what it does is it provides an automatic means which to authorize systems. In other words, if you go through this pipeline and you meet all the checks, when you reach the end, you go, and there's no paperwork to go sign, there's no delay, everything is done. You're already authorized, you're light it off. This means that then as a security shop, I can step back and begin focusing on the real threats surrounding the organization and less on that sort of like FISMA compliance piece. And of course, this also means that our USCIS has made a lot of really interesting inroads into zero trust. We've single sign-on across the 100% across the board. Almost all of our systems now are both auth and auth-Z. So we have the ability to make that next step into the zero trust world, where we're going to start looking at our assets, organizing them, categorizing them, and then taking that authorization and identification all the way down to the data layer. And that's really where we're focused on heading next.
That's great. Jeff, some thoughts for you on the defining the perimeter as it's dissolving.
No, I think there's been some good points definitely raised here already between, Kirk and Shane. I'll definitely add to those. I definitely am in agreement with Shane with regards to, the perspective of how we have to really kind of look at it, especially with further cloud adoption. And, it's really to a point now to where I think, at one time policy really tried to influence technology. I think we have to really look at it the other way around now, where our technology and choices and the way we're going really have to affect and influence policy. I spent a significant amount of my career in the Department of Defense and Intelligence community, and there was a simple perspective when we transitioned to the risk management framework of calling an SSP, right, a system security plan. We dropped the S. And it was important to drop the S to understand that, hey, today there really are no more systems, right? There are services, there are applications, there are so many things that we can kind of further define what that thing is that's running and how it's made up. So once we kind of had that fundamental perspective and we all share it, it really helps us kind of more collectively really kind of move forward and say how we really need to look at all of this. So yeah, definitely within our agency, again, we are very kind of heavily invested in the cloud. We've migrated a lot of applications. We built a lot of new things. We definitely take advantage of the serverless technology. If it doesn't require an operating system, it doesn't need all of those things, we definitely don't require it. We make really kind of smart choices when we look at interconnections between systems. And with all of this is really, again, it's more of a focus on the data. We're not really so much concerned so much about, hey, this operating system have the appropriate STIG and all of those settings. Yeah, those compliance things help drive really kind of great security controls. But at the end of the day, it's having that understanding of how the environment looks, what's really kind of being interchanged with everything. What are those kind of appropriate security mechanisms and capabilities we need to have in place to really kind of, make all of those things safe. So zero trust is really foundational to a lot of what we're doing as well. And it's just really building the building blocks of us really getting to a point where we really say there is no kind of boundary whatsoever. And we're very close to that already.
Yeah. Kirk, any thoughts on what Shane and Jeff have talked about and as it relates to the dissolving perimeter?
Well, I agree with them. I mean, they make some real good points. Obviously, they're the users, and that, we key off them as an industry partner. So I think the interesting part of the dissolved perimeter, it's going to be, like we said, it's going to be remote workers, but then adding in the cloud scenarios and the service providers. I think, we had a discussion point maybe later in this discussion about multi-cloud, and I think that that brings up some challenges. It's a great thing to have, so using multiple cloud providers, but I think there's some challenges there too. Again, I think it's from a security standpoint, I think there's some security challenges. I think the cloud providers have done a great job of providing security services, native security services for their customers. You have all the cloud providers now being FedRAMP approved at moderate and high FedRAMP cloud offerings, which is great. But ultimately, the government agencies, they share the responsibility to own their data. if something happens to that data in the cloud providers aren't going to stand up and say it's our fault.
Right.
The data owners have to take that responsibility. So it's really coming up with a holistic security solution that spans multiple cloud providers. And we tout centralized key management for utilizing all the data encryption services that cloud providers provide, and I think that's one of the challenges for the government agencies now is laying that framework out. I don't know who it was, either Shane or Jeff mentioned the risk framework. That's a great thing to look at and use when they start putting their security profiles in place. And I agree wholeheartedly with Jeff. The old SSPs, they don't exist anymore, right? There's no single system anymore. You got to look at the security policies and the security procedures and profiles basically across the whole entity now, and apply them at that level. There is no just endpoint security policies that you can really look at. So.
Yeah, and Kirk. So Kirk touched a little bit on the shared responsibility model. So let's move there just for a second, because I would love to take a look at that a little bit. As government and industry partners are increasingly, they're partnering to secure the data in the cloud. How can organizations implement a shared security model? I'd love to talk with, Shane, do you, any best practices that you've seen at your agency on kind of acquiring the shared responsibility model?
Yeah, I mean, I know this has been a topic of discussion for a while, and you see glimmers of hope here and there where there's a potential, and then it doesn't seem to go very far. And I'm not exactly sure why, because there's obviously a lot of synergy here. There's for both sides of that house. But in terms of what we can do as organizations to enter that, obviously there's a shared interest in securing information. I mean, whether you're a business or federal government, you're going to want to secure your information. That's a given. I think developing models around that, there's a lot of utility in that, but there's also, sometimes we become a little too reliant on those. And I always get a little nervous with them. And I've seen it time and time again where we go, we've applied the model and we've got greens on all of our little scorecardy things. Therefore we're secure and we're great. And then, the Russias, Chinas, the Irans of the world come in and take you apart. So, there's a lot to be said for having a good framework, and I do really like the system, the NIST risk framework for this, where they provide the sort of the high level, hey guys, this is what a framework looks like. Now go figure it out for yourselves, because organizations have culture, and culture is what drives your security program. If you're not careful, it can drive it in a good way and drive it right to the ground. So really, you focus on developing that overarching framework of what's important and what to prioritize, but then making sure you can have enough, fluidity in that framework to ensure that it matches to your culture. And because culture is everything in the security world.
Yeah, definitely. And Jeff, any thoughts on that from your perspective?
Yeah, I definitely agree with definitely a lot of the points that Shane identified there. The consumer, shared security model, I think is a really great one. I know I've really been impressed, and this is no kind of, backing or endorsement of, but I've really been impressed with what AWS has done in that space with regards to their different individual services and identifying those things that are responsibility of the cloud service provider and then that of the subscriber or the tenant. The more we can leverage, which that's all really kind of based off this anyway, but the more we can really kind of understand, again, our data, what it really is, right? The people who need access to it and so on, because the technical parts are always really easy. The more we can really kind of leverage a model like that, and again, to one exchange point, is really take a no-kidding risk management approach to really determining like what are those critical things that really need to be kind of implemented.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges I've seen today that we probably don't do the best job in that is really understanding what NIST already allows us to do, and that's somewhat of the customization, whether it's through RMF control tailoring and other things. It provides us that model to where we can be really selective about ensuring the appropriate security controls that we need and countering in other types of ways. Mm-hmm. So it's just really kind of making the model really kind of gel with that. And then us probably within our different organization levels, really kind of determining and slicing and dicing out our respective services and really being cognizant of who is responsible for what and how we would implement those.
Yeah, that's great. So a major challenge in securing data and the cloud is just the complexity of the IT environments. And Kirk kind of mentioned the multi-cloud is certainly one of those things. So this can leave people completely overwhelmed. One of the things I like to make sure, I often hear from people who attend events, is that they just, they're overwhelmed by these great ideas that they see from other agencies, but they really don't know where to begin. So I'd love some advice, where should security teams focus or even start in managing the complexity of data security today? And Kirk, I'm going to start with you to talk a little bit about the planning involved around that.
Yeah, sure. So Shane mentioned something earlier about going to the cloud was just an extension of their network, right? The on-prem, and people found out real quick that's just not the case. So, but from a security standpoint, it's actually one of the places to kind of start, right? And that is, how do we extend the security out into the cloud and into a multi-cloud environment? But that's to say that that's the right solution. So where I'm going with this is really you need to take a step back, identify the assets. What assets are you going to be putting out in the cloud? What cloud providers are you going to be using? What security services do they provide? And then how do you take control of some of those services and monitor them and manage them? So I'll give you an example. I read an article just the other day, and they did a study, and they said that I think it was about 90% of the breaches or cyber security attacks weren't even detected, and I think 50% of the valid attacks or successful attacks they hadn't even identified. So it gets back to something I've echoed before when I've talked to customers. You don't know what you don't know, and as people are now proliferating more out into the cloud, you're relying on some of the cloud providers to provide some of the security. But what you don't know is, are they doing the right monitoring? Are they doing the right protections? Do they have a good, I'll give you an example. Do they have a good insider threat program, right? So it's not all outside attacks that we have to, be aware of here. It's also the inside attacks. And as you proliferate out into a multi-cloud environment, you're actually expanding that portion or that attack vector. So, it's a big challenge, I think, for some of the agencies when they try to get their hands around this. But I think the first thing is to take a step back. We mentioned the risk framework. Use that as a template. I think it's a good place to start. You got to tailor it. You got to tailor it to the services you're going to be pushing first out into the cloud, and what data you're going to be pushing out there. Some data may fall under a moderate, and some data may fall under the high classification. So you really got to understand that first before you try to put a good security profile in place to protect that data.
Yeah. Shane, Jeff, any other thoughts to add for your peers to how to start?
Yeah, I've been asked this question a few times, and I always answer it in two ways, with two things. The first thing I tell people is cloud is different. And that sounds like a really simplistic overview or really oversimplistic statement, but it is a really, really important thing to understand, because cloud is just different, and clouds, plural, are different. So, to go in with the assumption that, I understand AWS, therefore I understand Google, or I understand Azure. No, you don't at all, actually. And so if you're going to make that leap, especially to like a multi-cloud sort of setup, you're going to want to make sure that you have the teams and the expertise in the areas in which you would need to focus. So if you're going to focus heavily into AWS, your team better understand AWS. If you're going to do both AWS and Google and Azure, you better have teams for all. The second point I always make is that automation is everything. So, if your infrastructure is code, your security is code. That means in your SOC, you better have developers. And in every incident, I've worked many as a CISO, I've worked many incidences that we've had in the cloud. And without fail, they involve developers every single time. This wasn't my security analysts in my SOC, doing security analyst work. These were developers writing code, helping us do these incidents and help us map out the logs and figure out what happened or didn't happen and trace it all back. So you have to, as a CISO, as a security professional, you got to begin changing your mindset and how that all operates. And I think one of the more, and they've been brought up several times, is the importance of cyber intelligence and threat intelligence and the applicability thereof. We are in the process of automating that for my organization. For me, cyber intelligence up until for most organizations is just a big long spreadsheet with a bunch of IOCs that you hope may or may not be applied to your organization. That seems a silly way to approach it. Intelligence is only good if it's relevant and it's applicable to your organization and you can take action on it. So we're automating as much of that as humanly possible so that we can begin taking advantage of it, because the cloud, and one of the things the cloud does is expands your horizons in all kinds of different ways, but also expands the volume of data that you're ingesting and dealing with on a daily basis. And for some bizarre reason, I know this comes as a shock to many who work in our field, you don't get plussed up on the security side just to meet it. So the way you deal with that is you start automating as much of your operations as humanly possible, and then of course ingesting in or bringing in the machine learning and the AI to help you filter through and determining what is normal. Determining what is normal is one of the is seriously one of the biggest challenges you'll face.
Yeah. And Jeff, any thoughts on that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think like always, these guys provide like really good points. It's always kind of hard to follow them up, but it's
you can just say ditto.
On-prem, right? I think, and it's been addressed here again by Kirk and Shane. One of the most fundamental things, especially in the concept of security, is that whole idea of you can't protect what you don't know about, right? So again, whether it's the cloud or it's on-prem, knowing and having visibility into your assets and data is probably the key and number one thing, right? That gives you the ability to further then kind of enable, again, what are those security protections that you're going to put in place? Especially we're really talking about the cloud and leveraging a lot of the native security capabilities, which are really great. But they're sometimes too appetizing because it's just the flick of a switch or the flick of a button, and you may not really know the kind of impact associated with those things. So it's all about kind of having a strategy even associated with that. And I think this also ties to the point about the consumer responsibility matrix with regards to kind of shared security. Is the more you're adopting and getting into the cloud, really having a good awareness of what you are responsible for in a service provider. Because once you get to that point again of even having visibility into assets, and Shane kind of spoke on this when he was talking about incidents. I'm actually working one today as we speak. I've had a call yesterday with a cloud service provider and today with one. And there's a lot of the really what I would call kind of foundational things that should have already been addressed and been in place with regards to what are your incident kind of response procedures when this happens? How do you investigate this type of activity? A lot of those things you kind of stumble on as you're actually working through something as it occurs. So I think, don't forget those foundational things that still need to exist as you move into that environment. It's really about quickly figuring out what's different and how you're going to have a plan and strategy to tackle it.
Definitely before we leave, two things. We're running out of time, which I could talk to you all for hours about this. But Kirk, let's talk a little bit about new technologies. We've got things like quantum computing and artificial intelligence. They're really threatening to upend the traditional cybersecurity practices. Certainly, we talked a little bit about using AI and machine learning. How can organizations start strengthening their cyber posture in anticipation of these new shifts?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing here is the technology evolves. I'll give you my opinion on this. What the biggest challenge, and then Shane and Jeff can chime in here. What the biggest challenges for the federal agencies would be. As new technology comes out, the biggest I think challenge they face is how to replace aging technology within the agencies to combat this, right? And it's going to have to be quickly done, because I think as you see the curve, the new technology curve is exponential. So, quantum computing, I'll give this an example. A couple years ago, people thought there won't be nothing available in 20 years, right? Well, people were wrong, right? There's some quantum computing being done right now and some small quantum computers being available. So I think that's accelerated much quicker than people anticipated. So we all know that NIST is now evaluating, got down to the finalists for the quantum resistant algorithms. And I think NIST has accelerated that timeline just so that people can start implementing and start looking at what this means from their security infrastructure standpoint and for industry. So I think the biggest thing for them to look at is how someone mentioned the agile. It's really being agile in their product deployments and in their security plans going forward. And they're going to have to look at services, products, and vendors, I think, that can accommodate this type of agile process. And when I say agile, that means, hey, we can move just as quick as the adversary's technology. So it's a hard thing to do because, again, you don't really know where the adversaries are going. But we always take a step back and we put ourselves in their shoes and say, well, knowing what we know from a security company standpoint, where would we be headed from that standpoint? And then we try to shoot for that. So we're doing a lot of work in quantum right now. We're doing some work in AI right now. AI is great. Someone mentioned earlier, it's great to be able to evaluate, do a large crunching of data. And from a response and I would say mediation and monitoring standpoint, AI is great, especially when it comes into characterizing, network traffic, characterizing users, stuff like that. So
Yeah.
those are two areas that we're looking at right now. And I think they're going to have the biggest impact, in the next probably 5 to 10 years.
Before we head to the breakout sessions, I want to talk to Jeff and Shane about culture. You both have indicated a lot, today about culture being an incredibly important part of a strong cybersecurity posture. Before we go, is there one takeaway that you can kind of give about, advice that you have for our audience about getting cybersecurity prioritized and properly resourced so that it becomes part of the culture? I'd love to, Jeff, I'll start with you, just some quick takeaways on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll really quickly touch on something Shane mentioned with regards to culture, and that was that the ability of an organization to really influence your cybersecurity program. I 100% believe and agree with that. And it's gotten to that point, I think it's important for IT and cybersecurity professionals to always remember what, IT is. And at the end of the day, it's an enabler of the mission. So, with regards to cybersecurity specifically, I think the more that we can do as cybersecurity professionals to show that cybersecurity is not this impediment or not this obstacle or just this compliance thing, but
Right.
hey, there's a real world mission thing you have, and we can not only further enable that, but we can do it in a way to where you can hopefully be more efficient and more secure at the same time.
Great.
And I think that's one of the really biggest things you can do. And ultimately, that's what the agency wants. So just having those right kind of conversations, I think, is really key.
Shane, the last word is yours.
Oh, great. I can say anything I want. No one say anything. No, we've talked a lot about our culture, and I'm a big proponent of it because I understand the impact of what it does to an organization on both sides of that coin. In terms of one key point for me has been, the importance of leadership here. Leadership can drive that security culture. When leadership makes something important, it becomes important to the organization. In USCIS's case, we've really enjoyed this full support of our senior leadership at the directorate level, even all the way up to secretary level, to the point where people embrace it, and not only that, they take it very seriously. So when my teams reach out to them because they're working an incident or there's a problem, whereas in the past we might have gotten a little pushback because they're really busy, they got things going on. The minute they understand there's an IT security issue at hand, they quickly jump in and become helpers as opposed to kind of obstacles. That was not an easy transition to make. I mean, that was a challenge. We had to, work at that, and there was a lot of briefings, and I literally went around the country doing like dog and pony shows, trying to get people to understand why it was important and why, and to Jeff's point, why even on the security side, we become that enabler as well. Because if we fail at our mission, we become that next OPM. Yeah. And I don't want to be the next OPM. Right. I'm happy letting OPM be that. I want to stay secure, and I want to make sure that the immigration system stays secure, and that the people who are employed by the immigration system can continue to do the job that they do. So getting that message out and really getting people to back that, really important, and it starts at the top.
Yeah. Thank you, Kirk, Jeff, Shane. Thank you so much for helping us kick this off. I mean, we could, you're such a great conversation and we could keep going. I wish we had more time, but we do not. So now we are going to move into the interactive portion of today's event where you, our audience, share your own perspectives. So in just a minute, you're going to be assigned your breakout room with a discussion facilitator and your peers. In that room, we ask you to participate in the discussion. While we encourage webcams for a more interactive experience, they are not required. So leading today's breakout sessions will be Nick Jovanovic, who is the Senior Vice President of Sales at TALUS Trusted Cyber Technology, Brett Hansen, Chief Technology Officer at TALUS Trusted Cyber Technology, and James Hansen, Vice President and Publisher, my colleague at NextGov. So just a couple housekeeping things. As we move to the breakout conversations, you're going to see a pop-up box prompting you to join the room. The one thing I'll just say is wait for the pop-up box, even as you'll see that the GEMG folks will tell you that like the moves are coming. There's a leave event button. Don't take that button. You want to wait for the pop-up to come and it'll say moving room, yes, and you change that way. So just a little note there. So you'll see the pop-up box prompting you to join. Please click on that to join the discussion. And then again, whenever you go to come back, they will warn you that we are going to be leaving the rooms. Wait for the pop-up box to click and go back in. So if you experience any difficulties in joining your breakout room, please contact GEMG Help in the chat box and they will help you. So enjoy your discussion and we're going to see you back here soon.